Hey guys, there's been a few requests for quick tutorial on how to attach new objects to a character as well as skin new objects to a character. The difference being that when you attach or parent constraint an object to the character, it's not going to ever change shape. So as you're customizing your character, keep that in mind. If it is something like a shoe and it needs to bend, or a skirt and it needs to bend, or a jacket and it needs to deform along with the arms, all of those would be examples of needing to skin an object. If it's something simple like a pair of earrings that follows the head, or a hat, or a new hair, those you could probably do with a parent constraint. So here you can see this is just a fresh copy of Pat. Up here it indicates what scene it is. This is Pat 2. So this is not, I don't want to alter this file because you always want to keep just a basic fresh copy of Pat around in case anything goes wrong. So the first step with customizing any character is to make sure that you go save scene as, and then come to your scenes directory and just name it something different. So here I'll call this Pat hat, and so this is what I'm going to do to Pat. I'm going to add a hat for Pat. The first thing that you'll want to do when you do any kind of importing of assets is you want to do a little housekeeping, make sure that everything's in order before you bring it into the scene so that it works correctly once you're here. Where I usually put any additional 3D assets that I'm going to add into any scene is usually in my assets folder. So here you can see I've got a couple FBX files. That's one type of 3D file that people use a lot for bringing things in and out of Maya. Another type might be an OBJ, but you could also put .ma or Maya ASCII files, or .mb, Maya binary files. So MAs, MBs, all of these things I usually put in the assets folder just so that it's easy to locate in the future. The other folder, or the other thing that's important to organize, is all the textures associated with those assets need to be put in the source images folder, so that when you open this project up later, it still knows where the textures are because everything's in the correct folder. So here in the source images file or folder, you can see that I have the trucker hat, the shoe texture, the Jordans, and the cowboy hat texture. So if I use any of these objects in the future, all my textures should work correctly. I shouldn't have to relink anything. Great. So once you have that set up, the next step is just bringing it into the scene. To do that, you just go File, Import, and then this is automatically kind of going to my assets folder because I have just been opening things. So if I just select the trucker hat, I can say import, and it brings it in. You can see that the texture is already linked up because it knows where to find it, which is in the source images folder. And the next step would be positioning it in space where you would want it to be most of the time when the character is moving around. So there's a hat, so I'm going to put it on his head. I'll go ahead and hide this hair, but with just Control H. Alternatively, if you wanted to have a hair that's, you can see it's already parent constrained, you can still adjust vertices on a model if it's only parent constrained, and it's really pretty safe. So if I position this hat, maybe scale it down just a little bit, and then position it so it's good, and this hair is still poking out, I could right click on the hair and go to face, select one of the faces, and then hit B to do soft selection, and just kind of move stuff out of the way. Push it back underneath of the hat. And this way you could still have hair, but it's not poking out of your hat, and everything's still looking correct. So now that I have my hat where I would like it to be, I can make sure to freeze transformations first, which is here. It's this little watch with an X on the poly modeling. It's located there. Or you can go to Edit, Delete by Type, History. So once you do that, it should be no more inputs over here in the shape, and you are ready to add a parent constraint. The important thing is the selection order for a parent constraint, and that order is this. Whatever joint you want it to follow, that's the one you select first. So I want it to follow the head, so I've selected the head joint first, and then holding Shift, I select the mesh that I want to follow second. Now that I have that selection, I can come up here to constraint, go to parent, hit the options box, and I'll just mention here, you want maintain offset turned on for the most part when you're attaching things like this. If you don't have that turned on, you can see when I hit apply, it kind of shifts it out of position. The reason is because it tries to put it at kind of related to this joint at 0, 0, 0. But we don't want that, so you just leave maintain offset checked. And then when you add, it stays put. But you can see that these blue indicators mean that this hat now has a parent constraint, and you can see it here in the underneath of where it inputs it has. So now when I move the head control, the hat follows right along. This can work for any mesh. It'll just parent constraint it to the rig. Next, I want to make sure to mention is if I were to be using the character scale or character size control, see how that kind of doesn't, the hat isn't following along correctly. The reason for that is that I need to make sure to add my new mesh into this group inside of the geometry folder or the geometry group for the pat character, this geo to scale. This is the one where you want to put your new hat. So if you select your hat first, hold Control on Windows or Command on Mac, and then select this group second and hit P, it'll put it inside of this group. Now, when you scale your character, you can see that the hat follows along correctly. So that's kind of the one last thing to keep in mind. If you're going to be kind of changing your character, or you have multiple characters using hats and you want them to be different sizes, just make sure to add any parent constrained geometry into this geo to scale group. That's an important note. The next option that I'll cover is adding in a new mesh that's going to be skinned to this character. For that, I'll use a pair of shoes. So once again, I'll come to File, go to Import, and bring in these Jordans. So you can see here that they're pretty much in the right place, so I don't have to do a whole lot to reposition them. But if you need to reposition them, please do that ahead of time. One thing to mention, so if I have an object and say I made my shoes from scratch and I've done these things where I extruded and did a bunch of stuff, all of those transformations that I just did, you can see over here that I've got inputs and I've got a bunch of these histories. So this is all now history on this object. So you can imagine if I had from scratch made a pair of shoes, or if I had from scratch made a new hair, I would have a lot of history over here. And this will slow down Maya significantly if you then attach that to the character and you try and start to animate that, because it's trying to keep track of all this information for the future. To get rid of all that, because when you skin this to your rig, you want to delete all your history so that it runs efficiently. So if you select your object that has history and you go to Edit, Delete by Type, History, you can see now that's all gone. So this would now be an object that's ready to be skinned. The Jordans are fresh and new, so they don't have any history, so I don't have to worry about them slowing anything down, but I'll go ahead and click the button just for good habit. Now that I've done that, I've got my shoes selected. I want to hold Shift and select the root joint of my skeleton. So this is the skeleton that I will be attaching these shoes to. With the rigging drop down turned on, I come over here to Skin, go to Bind Skin, and select that option. Now that I've done that, if you select the shoes, you can see here that it has these two inputs called Skin Cluster 3 or Tweak 3. Just as long as it's Skin Cluster or Tweak, that indicates that it is now skinned to pat. But when you go like this and you start to move the character around, you can see that weird things are happening with the mesh. This is because the paint weights aren't quite right. Maya does its best to guess as to what each vertex should do, but because it's a machine, it doesn't really know what's in your head. So you need to copy some skin weights from somewhere else, or you need to come in by right-clicking on it, saying Paint Skin Weights tool, and actually painting individual weights. I won't cover painting individual weights in this tutorial. That's something that you can easily Google. And maybe for a future class, I would talk about some methods and ways to do kind of faster paint weights. For this, we'll do the kind of easy and kind of straightforward copying of skin weights. So because Pat is all weighted up correctly, his foot deforms correctly as well as his ankle, I can copy that information from this model to my new one. So if I select that skin first and holding shift, I select my shoes second. I then want to come over here to the skin and say copy skin weights. So now you can see when I bend the foot using the heel ball control, the other foot's not moving, and I'm getting good information here in the ankle as well as in the toe. Everything seems to be lining up because I copied all that information from the original mesh. The final step, if you were wanting to add in something like these feet, so you can see that his original feet are still poking out here. So you can delete faces off of a skinned mesh and it will still function correctly for the most part. So you want to go ahead and delete any faces that are maybe poking out of your new geometry that you just attached. So I will hold Control and hit H to hide my, my shoes. And then I'm going to get rid of the geometry that I don't need anymore on the original Pat mesh. So if I hold right click, come down to face, and then I can select individual faces. I'll use this edge ring as my starting point. So if I select that face and then holding shift, I double click the face next to it, it'll actually do the entire edge ring. So it's just a selection trick. Now that I have those selected, if I hit delete, it'll actually just remove those from the world. Because these two are no longer connected, I can just double click the rest of the foot and it will highlight all the faces all at once. And then I can delete that as well. When I select in my outliner the Jordan's mesh and hit Control H, it will, or sorry, Shift H, it will reveal them again. So now it looks like he's just got some fresh kicks and these shoes bend around and move well. The last step for organization, just like the hat, you want to make sure to add your new geometry into your geometry group. But because this is a skinned mesh, you don't need to put it here in this special group, because as the joints scale, the mesh will also scale. So you can just put this next to the body or the brows by selecting anything in an outliner, or in the outliner. If you click and hold the middle mouse button or the scroll wheel, and then you drag around, you can see now I have an option to put it somewhere else. I'll just put it between the body and the brows. So now it's inside of the geo group. So when I shrink everything up, I don't have a bunch of extra stuff out here. So you can imagine if you made shoes and socks and maybe a shirt or some gloves or whatever, all those skinned meshes you would want to put inside of the geo group, but just next to those body meshes, not inside of the geo to scale group. Cool. So these are kind of the two ways of adding in some new geometry to the Pat rig. The final thing that I'll cover is something that Viscount brought up, which is maybe you want to have something that the character interacts with and then stops interacting, or like sets it down or something like that. A good example would be like a cup. So if you can imagine this kind of cylinder thing is maybe a very, very simple coffee cup, like that. So say this coffee cup, for part of the scene you want it to follow his hand, and then part of the scene you don't want it to follow his hand. That would be an example of turning off and on a constraint. But if you, for example, in your scene, if he had set his coffee cup down and then the coffee cup were to like fall, that would need its own keyframe animation. So the setup for any kind of props, you want to make sure to have your kind of original mesh here. So make sure your coffee cup is here in the middle of the world. And then once it's located in the right place, you want to put it in its own group. And to make a new group, you can just select any mesh and hit Control G. Now you can see over here it says group 1. So if I'm named my mesh cup, a good rule of thumb would just be cup group like that. Cool, so now this would be ready to do parent constraints. And the way that you want to do it is by selecting the group first and then whatever joint you want it to follow second. So if I hold control again, or sorry, if I hold shift and I select my wrist joint, now when I do a parent constraint, I actually want to use the option of not maintaining offset. And what that will do is it will snap this group right in place, right on top of the wrist. Oop, I selected it in the wrong order. So you want to go wrist first, then holding control, do your group second. Then you hit apply. And so that snaps that cup right in place. So now, anytime I move here, this cup is following. But I still have the freedom to come in and add keyframes without breaking the constraint. So I could position this afterwards, and it's going to be in the right place here. And then I could still add keyframe information like this. So on this frame it's there, and then on this frame it's there. So it will still animate correctly. That won't be broken. So at any time I could select my group and then turn off the parent constraint. And then when I'm moving the elbow, that cup won't follow anymore. So that's kind of the way that you would set up a prop. You have a group, you have your mesh inside of that group, and the group is the thing that you parent constrain. And if you remember, this is exactly how we worked with our car in our car animation. We used the car group, and that's the thing that we parent constrained to our locator, which then ran down the path. So that's the kind of the structure, the general workflow that you want to use for anything like that, if that's part of your scene. So like a sword or a bat or a cup, anything like that, I would recommend structuring it in this manner with the group, the mesh, and then the parent constraint, the group, to the joint. Awesome. Well, if you guys have any other questions about how to add in some new doodads to the character, just let me know through email, or I can set up a quick Zoom call and we can run through the character that way as well. Thank you. I'll talk to you soon.